No one expected Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett to directly confront Jimmy Butler in the middle of one of the most high-profile constitutional hearings in recent history. The quiet, packed courtroom held its breath as Barrett fixed her gaze on Butler. With confidence and authority in her voice, Barrett began, "Mr. Butler, your actions appear to disregard established legal precedents." All eyes turned to the man who is a popular star in basketball. This time, he wasn't wearing a t-shirt, a dark navy suit, or a tie, but his usual calm and determined demeanor remained unchanged. NBA star and technology entrepreneur Jimmy Butler stood there without hesitation. His hand steady, he opened the folder in front of him with a cool composure. What happened next shocked the entire jury. Before continuing the story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video if you enjoyed it. Let's continue where we left off. The legal battle between the Federal Communications Commission and J-Connect had become a national issue. The subject of the dispute was whether Butler's newly established social platform had violated federal content regulations by refusing to implement mandatory moderation policies. The FCC claimed that Butler's platform had violated official compliance protocols. Legal experts were certain he was heading toward a crushing defeat. Morning shows were saying, "No one can defy the government and win." But Jimmy did something no one expected. He prepared in a way no one had ever seen before. While the government focused on his challenge, Butler focused on the Constitution. The courtroom was filled with high-ranking officials, law professors, and spectators lucky enough to witness what many thought would be the public humiliation of a defiant celebrity. But Judge Barrett quickly realized that the man before him was no ordinary, impulsive figure. "Mr. Butler," she continued, "your platform has repeatedly ignored official requests to comply with the changes made to Section 230 of the 2023 Communications Act. Do you believe your company is exempt from the rules that govern all other communication platforms?" Jimmy leaned slightly toward the microphone. His voice was calm and controlled. "With respect, Judge Barrett, that is not entirely accurate. We have not sought an exemption from applicable laws." Barrett's eyes narrowed. "Your actions suggest otherwise. You received 17 notices." 16, Jimmy corrected softly. There was a stir in the courtroom. "Pardon?" Barrett's voice sharpened. "There were 16 notices," he repeated, "and we responded to each one, based on legal precedents." Judge Barrett hesitated. Chief Justice Roberts seemed ready to intervene, but Barrett raised his hand slightly, indicating he would handle it himself. "Mr. Butler," he said, "this court has no patience for technicalities." "But this isn't a technical detail," Jimmy replied, lifting the first page of his file. "This is a constitutional issue. I think the court will want to examine the evidence that the FCC deliberately misrepresented our position." The file, which looked ordinary from the outside, contained a storm, a year of intense legal preparation. He had spent a year poring over constitutional law like NBA playoff tapes. Jimmy had read hundreds of case files, including the opinions written by the judges sitting before him. Judge Sonia Sotomayor looked at Judge Kagan. Judge Alito leaned forward. Barrett's voice hardened. "Mr. Butler, the court reviewed the briefs. Are you implying that we overlooked important evidence?" Jimmy didn't even blink. "No, Your Honor. I am implying that the petitioners withheld this evidence." The government's lead attorney jumped to his feet. "Your Honors, this is a baseless and ugly accusation." Barrett turned his eyes back to Jimmy. "These are serious allegations. Without concrete evidence, they could undermine your entire case." Jimmy shook his head. "I understand. That's why I brought the evidence." He opened a page marked with a red tab. "These documents," he said, "show that the FCC's requests violate 3 separate Supreme Court decisions. One of them was written by you, Judge Barrett." A silence fell over the courtroom. Judge Barrett's eyes didn't move, but his posture changed. He leaned forward slightly. He made a gesture. "Which decision?" he asked. "Net Choice v. Paxton, 2024, Jimmy replied. "The decision you wrote that government agencies cannot compel private platforms to censor content equivalent to government speech through regulation." The courtroom was silent, but the tension was electric. Judge Clarence Thomas, who had remained silent up to that point, spoke. Mr. Butler, are you arguing that the FCC's directives constitute indirect speech control? Yes, Judge Thomas, and I have prepared a comprehensive legal analysis to support that claim. At that moment, the wind changed direction. Even the skeptics in the courtroom noticed. This was not a celebrity pretending to understand the Constitution. This was a man who, once again, was fighting to the end, not on a basketball court, but on another court, and he had no intention of backing down. Jimmy handed the documents to the court clerk. He was as determined as if he were passing the ball in a game. When the clerk distributed the files to all members, including the chief judge, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew even heavier. Mr. Barrett, said Jimmy, pointing to the page with the red stripe in the file, these documents clearly show how the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, developed a strategy to circumvent a decision you wrote. Barrett furrowed his brow slightly. That's a pretty serious allegation. What kind of documents are we talking about? Jimmy took a deep breath. Internal communications we obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. Notes discussing how FCC officials could use technical regulations to indirectly pressure content moderation companies to comply with your court's decision in NetChoice v. Paxton. Murmurs began in the courtroom. Justice Alito was carefully reviewing the documents, lowering his glasses and leaning over the pages. Justice Kagan took a note. Sotomayor was looking directly at Jimmy. Barrett remained calm. He reviewed the documents. Then he looked up and turned to the government's attorney. Mr. Solicitor General, she said, will you be providing any explanation of the contents of these documents? The government's lawyer cleared his throat slightly. Your Honor, these documents are not part of the lower court record. We need time to verify their accuracy. Just then, Jimmy spoke up again. His tone was soft enough to maintain the respect of the court, but his words carried weight. These documents show that the FCC is attempting to censor content under the guise of technical compliance. The meeting minutes include the following statement by Commissioner Thompson, and I quote, Barrett's opinion may directly limit our intervention, but we can achieve the same result indirectly through technical regulations. A chill swept through the courtroom. Some judges looked up. Others searched for the sentence in question. Barrett's gaze hardened. He shook his head slowly and spoke again. Mr. Attorney General, do you have any comment on that statement? The lawyer shook his head vaguely. Your Honor, quotes taken out of context can be misleading. All of the FCC's actions have been taken in the public interest. You can find the context on the following pages, Jimmy interjected. In the continuation of the same meeting, it is explicitly discussed how technical compliance can be used as a tool for political pressure. At this point, Barrett reviewed the documents once more. He paused for a long time before closing the file. Mr. Butler, he said, when and how did you obtain these documents? Jimmy had his answer ready. 3 weeks ago, as a result of a separate FOIA lawsuit we filed in the Ninth Circuit Court. The FCC had previously successfully applied to have these documents removed from the record. Justice Alito stepped forward. Mr. Butler, are you claiming that these documents were deliberately withheld from the courts? Jimmy bowed his head. Your Honor, the documents speak for themselves. The FCC sought indirect means to circumvent the constitutional limits set forth in the NetChoice decision, and discussed this openly internally. Barrett was no longer on the defensive. He had to admit that the man across from him was serious, prepared, and that the material he had was not just a theatrical defense, but a genuine constitutional counter-argument. Mr. Butler, Barrett said, your legal basis is not limited to citing previous decisions. You are arguing that the FCC's regulations serve unconstitutional purposes. Jimmy fixed his eyes directly on him. Exactly, Your Honor. And those purposes align with the practices you banned just over a year ago. The courtroom held its breath. Justice Barrett's expression did not change, but those who knew her well knew that even the slightest flicker in her eyes spoke volumes. Surprise, and perhaps respect. Jimmy turned to another page in his file. It was marked with a bright yellow post-it note. Your Honor, he said again, his voice betraying neither fear nor arrogance. I would like to draw your attention to page 47. Here, FCC officials clearly use the following statement in a correspondence between themselves. Even if legal direct intervention is limited, it is still possible to achieve the same result through technical rules. Justice Barrett leaned over the paper. Her eyes darted across the lines as she examined the documents. The Justice Department attorney stepped forward. His tone was tense. Your Honors, these documents are out of context and misinterpreted. The FCC has been careful to stay within constitutional limits in content regulation. Jimmy shook his head silently. Then another sentence came, echoing off the courtroom walls. The context is already here, Your Honor. FCC officials, while seeking ways to circumvent your views, referred to these as useful preliminary methods. Justice Barrett raised her head, holding the documents in her hands. Her eyes seemed to pierce through Jimmy. Mr. Butler, she said, did you obtain these documents recently? Jimmy, yes, just 3 weeks ago. Access had been blocked because the FCC had sealed these documents during the lower court proceedings. However, through an independent FOIA lawsuit, we obtained them via the Ninth Circuit Court. At that moment, Justice Alito interjected. Mr. Butler, are you saying that the FCC concealed unconstitutional regulations from the judicial process? Jimmy replied without blinking. That's what the documents say, Your Honor. The truth is right here. The atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. This was no longer a punitive hearing against a celebrity, but a constitutional battle between an individual and the state. Justice Barrett slowly closed the file. Mr. Butler, you are not a lawyer. However, what you have presented here appears to be based on serious constitutional grounds. Jimmy smiled slightly. That's right, Your Honor. I am known as an athlete, but before this case began, I spent thousands of hours studying constitutional law. Because this wasn't just about my company, it was about freedom of expression. And this sentence you wrote became my roadmap, he said, turning the page and reading. When state power attempts to achieve what the Constitution directly prohibits by using its regulatory authority indirectly, courts must exercise extraordinary caution. Jimmy had quoted from Barrett's own decision. Complete silence reigned in the courtroom. Only the sound of court papers could be heard. Justice Jackson raised her head slightly. She was looking intently at Jimmy. The other judges scanned the documents in front of them, as if trying to understand the statements. Barrett turned back to Jimmy. Mr. Butler, while the FCC's directives appear to be aimed at technical compliance, are you saying that their real goal is content control? Jimmy's answer was clear. Yes, and these internal documents prove it. The purpose of all the regulations was to determine which views would be allowed on our platform. That is direct censorship. Barrett narrowed his eyes and stared at Jimmy for a long moment. Then why hasn't any other platform raised a constitutional challenge like yours? Jimmy replied without hesitation. Because challenging the federal government takes courage and resources, Your Honor. For most companies, the easiest path is compliance. We had both the resources and the conviction. A strange silence fell over the courtroom, but this time, it wasn't out of fear, it was out of awareness. Jimmy Butler hadn't come to this courtroom merely as a defendant. He had brought a principle, a struggle, and perhaps a lesson. Barrett shook his head slowly, never taking his eyes off Jimmy. The constitutional foundation you've presented appears far more solid than I initially anticipated, Mr. Butler. And with those words, the entire courtroom felt the gravity of the moment. From that moment on, nothing was the same. The government's representative, who had started his defense with confidence, couldn't pull it together, his words coming out broken and disjointed. The judge's expressions had changed. No one saw Jimmy as just a basketball star anymore. They realized that he was a citizen fighting for the Constitution. Justice Alito spoke up, holding up the document in his hand. Mr. Butler, the document we see here, particularly the statement by FCC Commissioner Thompson, shows that regulatory power was systematically used to exceed constitutional limits. Are you claiming that these communications were deliberately withheld? Jimmy opened the second file he had placed in front of him. Yes, these documents were deliberately removed from the lower court records. The FCC systematically sought to conceal its content regulation strategies under the guise of technical compliance. We obtained these documents through a FOIA lawsuit we filed 3 weeks ago in the Ninth Circuit. Access had been completely blocked prior to that. Justice Jackson glanced at the notes in the file and muttered softly. Jimmy looked up when he heard his own words. "And here it is, Judge Jackson," he said. "Your dissenting opinion set our course. In the D.C. Circuit decision, you wrote that these constitutional questions are fully ripe for review by the Supreme Court." Judge Jackson raised his eyebrows and locked eyes with Jimmy. The look was one of surprise, but there was also admiration. At this point, the government's attorney made a final push. "Your Honors, let us not forget that J-Connect, Mr. Butler's platform, repeatedly failed to comply with regulatory guidelines. While every other platform complied, they refused to do so." Justice Barrett turned sharply. "Counsel, if these guidelines were created for unconstitutional purposes, widespread compliance is not proof of constitutional legitimacy. It is a sign of voir dire and suppression." The courtroom was silent. At that moment, Chief Justice John Roberts spoke up. His tone was serious but impartial. "I believe we will need to review these documents in their entirety. Counsel, we request a complete and transparent explanation of the FCC's internal communications." Counsel swallowed. "Of course, Mr. Chief Justice." Jimmy listened quietly. His victory was being built not with words, but with attention. Barrett took the floor again. "Mr. Butler, we would like to hear you again. It seems that this is not just a matter of whether your company complies with regulations or not. This is a case about redefining the limits of state power." Jimmy nodded. "Exactly, Your Honor. This case concerns not just J-Connect, but the future of all private platforms. If these regulations remain in effect, every company will be forced to adjust its own speech boundaries according to the state's preferred views." Judge Thomas leaned forward slightly. "So you're saying this isn't a content battle, but a battle of principles?" Jimmy looked around the courtroom and replied, "Exactly. This is a battle for freedom, and this time, it's not being fought on the field, but in the Supreme Court." Everyone in the courtroom felt the resolve in Jimmy's words. This was more than just a case. This was a moment that would redefine the boundaries of America's understanding of free speech. That day, the following headline began trending on social media for the first time. "Jimmy Butler is not just a star, he's now a constitutional warrior." This headline was more than just a label. People began to adapt his words, his stance, his silent yet powerful challenge to their own lives. Because standing before Jimmy was not just an institution, but the seemingly untouchable rule-makers of the system. And he was walking forward, not with millions of dollars in his hands, but with the Constitution and his resolve. 3 days later, the Supreme Court broke from tradition. Without waiting for the usual months-long decision process, it issued a temporary administrative stay on all relevant Federal Communications Commission regulations. This decision was described by legal historians as an extraordinary shift in position. A legal expert on CNN's live broadcast remarked in astonishment, "Justice Barrett initially took a very tough stance against Jimmy Butler, but in the end, she took his constitutional argument seriously and, frankly, accepted its merits. This is not just a victory for an athlete. This is a lesson in the rule of law delivered by one of the people." At that moment, Jimmy was not in front of the cameras. He was slowly descending the court steps. Journalists were shouting, "Jimmy, did you expect this outcome?" He stopped. His eyes were still calm. "No," he said. "I just said what I believed to be true, and I prepared for it. Justice Barrett's previous legal opinions were a map for me. I just followed that map." Another journalist jumped in. "Did you manage to convince him?" Jimmy laughed sincerely. "I didn't try to change anyone's mind. I just showed what was there. I defended what I believed in, based on the law." That day, social media erupted again. Animations made from courtroom sketches, video collages narrating Jimmy's defenses, excerpts from documents read on podcasts. All of it underscored one thing. This was no longer just Jimmy Butler's issue. It was everyone's issue. First Meta, then Google, announced they were reviewing the FCC's content guidelines. Companies that had previously lacked the courage to object found new resolve thanks to the documents Jimmy presented in court. The Harvard Law Review announced a special issue dedicated to the case. It included this statement: "Jimmy Butler proved that constitutional law is not written on college campuses, but in the real world. A week later, a former FCC lawyer broke his silence. Speaking on condition of anonymity, he told the press, yes, there were phrases like indirectly forcing content moderation used internally. The technical rules were designed as a tool for political influence. Jimmy's departure tore down that curtain. The lawsuit against Jimmy was not over. The final decision had not yet been made, but the tide had turned. The wind was blowing in a different direction in court. Courts do not just enforce the law, they also weigh its spirit. And this time, what they weighed was a freedom that an athlete defended with his heart. Jimmy didn't just walk out of a courtroom that day. That day, he stepped onto another field to defend the boundaries of the law. And everyone realized, this time there was no ball, no basket. But he had changed the rules of the game once again. If this story moved you, don't just watch. Share your thoughts in the comments. Be a voice in this fight. And remember, true justice sometimes begins not on the field, but in the heart.